Here we're going to work through two examples, one where a table is given to us and then another where we need to form the table ourselves using some rules of probability, which will be similar to something we'll be seeing on our written assignment. So for this first one, we have a probability model shown below, but something we need to make note of is that we have a probability missing here. So we have the number of repair calls made in an hour or received in an hour, and we can have outcomes of 0 calls, 1 call, 2 calls, 3 calls, and then that would just suggest that they don't see more than 3 calls in an hour at this appliance repair shop. All right, getting 0 calls has a 0.1 chance, 1 call is a 0.3, 2 calls is a 0.4, and then we're missing here. What we need to remember is that all of those probabilities need to add up to exactly 1. So to complete the table, what I'm going to do is take 1, and I'm going to take out those probabilities that we know, and that will give me my remainder. So take out 0.1, 0.3, 0.4, and that should leave me with a 0.2. So I can fill in that part of the table with a 0.2. Okay, how many calls should the shop expect per hour? Include units on all means. So we're going to go ahead and go through Staplet with this. But actually, for this one, I'll show how to find it by hand, because this is a case where it might be more straightforward to just go into a scientific calculator. But I'm looking ahead at standard deviation, and with that, we'll just use Staplet. But what it would look like to calculate the expected value, we would take 0 times 0.1 plus 1 times 0.3 plus 2 times 0.4 plus 3 times 0.2. And so that's going to give us a 1.7. So that would tell me, I'm going to round that to a whole number because in terms of number of calls per hour, it's going to be a whole number. So I'm going to say the shop can expect about 2 calls per hour. You could also phrase this as they could expect 1 to 2 calls per hour, since it's landing in between 1 and 2. Either way is good with me. Mostly for my open math, it'll want exact values, so like you'd plug in 1.7, but when you make your sentences, round to what makes sense to you. Okay, for standard deviation, let's go to Staplet for that and run through those steps again. So I'm going to go back to Staplet, discrete random variables, and with this scenario, we have 4 possible outcomes. So I'm going to make sure I have 4 rows. I'm going to call this calls per hour. And we could have 0 calls, 1 call, 2, or 3. And then for the probabilities, we have a 0.1, 0.3, 0.4, and a 0.2. I'm going to go ahead and begin analysis. And with that, there I can see that mean of 1.7, so I could use that to check my answer, and then a standard deviation of 0.9. So standard deviation is coming up to 0.9, which means that I'm going to go back and add to my sentence. It's just nice to put mean and standard deviation together. So the shop can expect about 2 calls per hour. On average, this will deviate by about 1 call. So what that really tells me is that we're really expecting 1 to 3 calls here. So expected value gives us an idea of where we expect to land, but then standard deviation lets me know about the variability of it, of where it could possibly go. I'll write down the setup of how you would calculate by hand just to show another example of that. So what we would do is I would make my table of the squared deviations and then multiplied by their probabilities. So what that would look like is I would have my x value of 0, take away the mean and square it, and then I would do this for each of the cases where I go 0 calls, 1, 2, 3. We're subtracting away the mean, which stays the same as we go to each case. And then we're multiplying with its probability, which would be 0.1, 0.3, 0.4, 0.2. And then if we add up those values, that would give us variance. And then if I wanted standard deviation, I would take the square root of what we got for variance, and that would get me to 0.9. So that could be a good exercise to try that out on your own, plug it in the calculator, and make sure you can get to that 0.9 there. Okay, then there's some follow-up questions. So what is the probability they get 2 repair calls? So the probability notation I would use here is the probability that x is equal to 2. And with that, I just look it up on the table, and that's a 0.4. So there is a 40% chance they get 2 repair calls. What is the probability they get at least 1 repair call? So at least 1 is the same as more than or equal to. So my notation would go x more than or equal to 1. So 1's the very least value, and we want to add up everything equal to 1 and above. And just looking at the table, what I would be kind of thinking is, okay, 1 is the least, so I want everything to the right as well. So I'd be adding up those probabilities there. So I'd take a 0.3 plus 0.4 plus 0.2. And that would give me a 0.9. So there is a 90% chance they get at least 1 repair call. What is the probability they get at most 2? So that means 2 is the largest. So we want the probability that x is less than or equal to 2. So 2 would be the largest, and then we're going to include everything below. So with that, we would be adding up the 0.1, 0.3, and 0.4, which would be a 0.8. So there is an 80% chance they get at most 2 repair calls. What is the probability they get less than 2 repair calls? The probability that x is less than 2. So this case, let me go back to my table here and kind of show visually. Less than 2 is everything below 2 and not including 2. So this would be the same thing as like less than or equal to 1, but strictly less than 2 is not going to include 2 with it. So with that, we're going to be adding 0.1 and 0.3. So with that, there is a 40% chance they get less than 2 repair calls. Class. Good old typos. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's an example of a case where maybe you need to fill in a table, maybe you need to evaluate probabilities. Expected value and standard deviation we could do by hand or with Staplet. And just to emphasize, if I do ask you to show your work by hand, you can set it up however you want to. That table kind of setup is something I just kind of made up in my brain and helps me organize it. Whatever helps you is good. And then you can always use Staplet to double check your answer. But I'm going to stop the video here, and then we'll go on to the next question, which will be similar to your written assignment where you have to form the table. And then we're going to do some work with talking about unfair games.